Good evening and welcome to the first event of our three-part virtual series called Santa Barbara Belonging, Commemorating Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. I'm Kai Tepper, board member and co-chair of the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation's Asian American Affinity Group. I'm honored to introduce tonight's presentation titled Understanding Our History. As we begin this event, we want to acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our region. Let's take a moment to honor these ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathered upon and support the resilience and strength that all Indigenous people have shown worldwide. We are on the traditional territory of the Chumash peoples. The month of May is National Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Throughout the history of the United States, Asian American Pacific Islander, or AAPI, communities have made significant contributions that have helped build our nation. These same AAPI communities, however, have faced generations of adversity and injustice at the hands of racism. Over the past several months, acts of violence and racism against Asian Americans have escalated across the country, causing fear and outrage within our communities. The time is now to gather as AAPI community members, as friends, and as allies to explore the complex history of racism and the Asian American experience, listen to and get to know our local Asian American small business owners, and to celebrate the vital and diverse cultural traditions of our Asian American community. As a member of the AAPI community in Santa Barbara, I can proudly say that we belong here. Thank you for choosing to be here with us tonight. By coming together this evening in just being here, we are expressing resistance to the ignorance, prejudice, and racism that has fueled acts of violence against the AAPI community. These acts have caused outrage and fear for many of us. To lay the groundwork for healing and action, we will begin with a historical overview of the Asian American experience. Tonight, for the first part of our Santa Barbara Belonging series, historian and professor Dr. Lilian Welty will provide this historical background, and then the Trust Director of Programs, Danny Tsai, will share a brief history of our local AAPI community. Some housekeeping details. Our presentation this evening will be closed captioned with subtitles for the convenience of our audience. You can find the control to turn on or off subtitles in the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom screen. It is a CC icon that you can click on to get a drop-down menu with options. If you do not see the CC icon, click on the More icon with the 3 dots, and you should see the option there. This presentation will be recorded and will be made available at a later date on the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation website and YouTube channel. During the presentations, you can ask your questions using the Zoom chat function or by submitting them using the Q&A function. Both are located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you use the chat function and would like other audience members to see your question, you will need to hit the drop-down menu in the chat box to make sure you send it to all panelists and attendees. After our 2 presentations, our speakers will be joined by the Trust's Executive Director, Ann Peterson, and together they will answer some of your questions. We will not get to all of your questions, but we will do our best to address as many as we can. Before we begin, we'd like to poll all of you in our audience to learn a bit about who you are and what brought you here. Kevin will pull up a Zoom poll question, and we'll wait a minute to share those results with you all. So the first question is, I'm a member of the AAPI, or what brought you here tonight? Either I'm a member of the AAPI community and want to learn more and be involved, or I'm an ally of the AAPI community and want to learn more and be involved.
Okay, we almost have everyone answered. Just a few more seconds for the stragglers. Here we go. Okay, so I'm gonna end the poll and share the results now.
Thank you. That's great. Well, whatever brought you here, we really appreciate you all being here together. Before I introduce Dr. Tamai, I'd like to thank our Santa Barbara Belonging series sponsor, the Griffiths Foundation. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening, Dr. Lilian Welty Tamai. Dr. Lilian Welty Tamai is a lecturer at UCLA in the Asian American Studies Department and previously served as the curator of history at the Japanese American National Museum. She earned a doctorate in history from the University of California, Santa Barbara. She conducted research in Japan and in Okinawa as a Fulbright Graduate Research Fellow and was also a Ford Foundation Fellow. She co-edited Shapeshifters, Journeys Across Terrains of Race and Identity. Her forthcoming book titled Military-Industrial Intimacy, Mixed Race American Japanese, Eugenics and Transnational Identities, documents the history of mixed race American Japanese born after World War II and raised during the post-war period. She co-authored Chapter on Mixed Race in the Harry Potter series that will be coming out later this year. She also served on the US Census Bureau National Advisory Committee on Racial, Ethnic, and Other Populations.
Thank you so much, Kai, for that lovely introduction. And I want to thank the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation and with Ann Peterson's leadership to have this dialogue and for inviting me here to get to speak with all of you today. It's such a pleasure to know that there's so many community members who are committed to this really addressing this racism in the United States in this current sense of where we are and how we might be able to move forward as a community. So thank you so much for giving me a chance to get to chat with everyone, with you guys tonight. So I have a presentation that I'd love to, I have some slides and just a couple things I'd like to talk about. We only have, just a short time together. And so I'm only going to be able to highlight just a few points with the hopes that these will be like seeds and that I will leave you to water them and to plant them and to care for them and think more about these issues in the coming months and years. And so let me start. All right. So yes, so thank you very much again for giving me this opportunity to share a little bit of what I've learned over the course of my research and teaching career. So in the last several months, a wonderful site that houses and uses excellent census data, AAPI data, did a survey and asked many Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the US what their experiences were with hate crimes and hate incidents. And so I think when we start to look at this, these numbers might not be that stark, right? Maybe 10% for some people that they polled. Maybe they were polling folks who happened to be very aware of this, and so we can certainly try to critique the ways in which this data was brought together. However, I think what we have to kind of consider here is that this question of ever experiencing hate crimes or hate incidents, and I think what's very telling here is that, I don't know about any of you, but the question could be asked of everybody here as well if we had another poll. Have you ever experienced any hate crimes or hate incidents? More so in the last year. And I think it's this discussion that we kind of have to address here. One of the things that people like to say is that perhaps this is something that's, it's so recent. We never had any problems before, right? I was interviewed for a short piece in the Ventura County Star. I live in Ventura County. And someone quoted in the same article as I was said, oh, well, I've lived in Thousand Oaks for 40 years and I've never had any problem with this, right? And I think, a lot of these things, it just depends, right? It depends on how old you are, it depends on where you live, and it depends on a lot of things. But the one thing I think that is a constant, whether we want to pretend that this is something new or not, is that in the United States, particularly for Asian Americans, hate crimes and this kind of historic xenophobia is not new. When we start to look at, right, over the course of Asian American belonging and Asian American, the Asian American experience in the United States, we have had this long history of treating Asian Americans as if they were a yellow peril in the 19th century. And I know that a lot of people say, well, this is a question about Asian American hate crimes or discussions about, where Asian Americans are today in the 21st century. It's 2021. Why do we have to kind of go back to look at this history? And I think once we do, we start to see that there's a trend, right? We're seeing that this is just a piece of this longer conversation of the position of Asian Americans in the United States. This is not the first time that Asian Americans have been treated as a public health menace, right? That we've the kind of terminology we've used, or at least the previous leadership in the United States has used. And when we start to look at this, not just the 19th century, but in the 20th century as well, we've had even historic xenophobia, but also imperialism in Asia. And Asia is not Asian America. That is clear. But it's that xenophobia that gets translated into policy and into structural racism in the United States, with Japanese American incarceration likely being one of the largest, most prominent aspects of that xenophobia becoming tangible. But also too, during World War II, during the Korean War, and during the Vietnam War, we've had this extension of American imperialism and the extension of American empire in those places. And particularly in Korea, where we established military camp towns, creating a space for legalized prostitution and sexualizing Asian women. Those ideas about sexualization may make folks feel uncomfortable, but I think it's that idea of that has permeated the ways in which we think about Asian American women. And in the last administration exacerbated this idea of anti-Asian sentiment, in particular by using words to scapegoat Asians and also Asian Americans. And for many people in the United States, they may not be able to distinguish different Asian ethnicities, or they may not be able to distinguish the difference between, if you are from Asia and an immigrant, or you are third or fourth generation Asian American. Those things often get conflated, and then everybody loses, right? But I think some of what we have to consider is, of course, that what is rooted here is this idea of the yellow peril. And many people may have heard of the yellow peril, but I'm going to just, I like definitions because I think then we're all on the same page. But yellow peril was a racist color metaphor that perpetuated that people from East Asia were encroaching on the West, right? It was this xenophobic theory of colonialism. And so with this, it's this idea, the permissibility that we can exclude certain people, that the only way to prevent this yellow peril from coming onto our shores is to create immigration legislation that's going to close that, that's going to stop us from what the Chinese were going to do. Furthermore, it's also when we look at many of the political cartoons at the time, we start to see that despite America's need for labor, we've always had more labor and not enough people to do that labor than when we needed workers to help us build our transcontinental railroad. The Chinese immigrants came to fill that labor vacuum. And once the railroad was completed, we no longer needed Chinese workers. Sociologist Rossel Pereñas says this about what America projects upon our laboring immigrants. We want the worker and not the person. And once the job is done, there's a sentiment that we don't need those people. But I think what we see here too is that, particularly for the early Chinese American community, this sentiment, and this is what coming back to this idea that this is not new. In 1871, there was a tremendous Chinese massacre in Los Angeles, despite there being only about 200 Chinese living in the area, mostly relegated to Chinatowns at the time. And just to show, this is there were so few pictures, but these are the kind of images that came out at that time. In 1885, there was a Chinese massacre in Rock Springs, Wyoming, indicating that it wasn't just Chinatowns in California, but also this sentiment was very real. This anti-Asian sentiment was real in other parts of the country. in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, when we had many, many Filipino workers coming to fill the labor vacuum to help pick fruit and do cannery work in along the West Coast of California. In Watsonville, there was a riot that lasted 5 days, right? Many whites felt economically threatened and chased out those Filipino farm workers. In the 1980s, when the US economy was kind of feeling a little bit behind based on Japan's economic ascension, via the Japanese automotive industry. Vincent Chen, who was celebrating his bachelor party and was to be married the following day, was bludgeoned with a baseball bat by 2 unemployed auto workers in Detroit because he was mistaken for being a Japanese auto worker. And so I think what we're seeing is there's this sense of, economic anxiety can somehow be a good reason to invoke violence upon other communities. And I think, maybe we can kind of stop calling it economic anxiety, and maybe we should call it for what it is. Perhaps we should call it racism, right? Perhaps we should say that this is part of this longer history of the anti-Asian movement, because when we address it in that way, I think what we are able to do is kind of tackle this at the root of this issue. What is at stake here? What is happening, and what are we seeing? We're seeing oftentimes these are happening in periods of transition. And so the ways in which many in the United States, particularly those in the leadership, the ways in which they tried to address these anxieties, which were again often rooted in race, was to create policies and legislation that helped to restrict, harass, or detain, and even incarcerate Asians and Asian Americans. And I say this, and I want folks to know this, because I don't know about you guys, I didn't learn about these things. I maybe learned about the 1882 Exclusion Act in high school and in college, but I did get Japanese American incarceration in college, but that was not till I got there, right? We don't learn about these things. We don't hear about these atrocities. And I think and that's part and parcel why we are somehow not equipped with the kinds of vocabulary to be able to call these things out, to recognize that this is a larger pattern. In 1875, the U.S. Congress passed the Page Act that restricted Chinese women from entering the United States. They stereotyped, right? There was this assumption that Chinese women with unbound feet were only going to come and work in prostitution, and and many of those women were detained as a result, and detained for months, sometimes years, until they could prove who they were. In 1882, as many folks know about the Chinese Exclusion Act, this prevented Chinese from entering the United States. The railroad was complete. We no longer needed Chinese workers, and there's growing anti-Asian sentiment allowed Congress to pass the only Exclusion Act and legislation that targeted a particular ethnic group. All of this, decades of this, really led us to the 1924 Immigration Act that was really designed to prevent Japanese from entering the US. Japanese, and therefore all Asians, were then barred from entering the US, except for a very, very small quota. Really one of the most egregious pieces of legislation, I think, in the 20th century is Executive Order 9066 that incarcerated Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were US citizens born in the United States. And those who were living on the West Coast were forced into 10 incarceration camps in the interior of our country. And so this is just, I think, really highlighting what we're seeing is, again, over and over, there is something about this question of, right, are Asians able to become American? Are they foreign somehow, right? Is their Asianness somehow preventing them from actually becoming American? And so the thing I want to kind of share too is, I think when we look at COVID-19 and we look at all of the sort of sentiment and the contemporary ideas about Asians and Asian Americans, there's a sense that we're looking at Chinese and Chinese Americans, and by default, other Asians, as perhaps a public health crisis. And this is nothing new. Again, when we look back at the historic record, we see that there was a fear that perhaps Chinese immigrants pictured here, that they were a potential public health threat, that they need to be checked upon entry to the United States. Angel Island in San Francisco was the counterpart on the West Coast to Ellis Island. Many of us are familiar with this Ellis Island story of immigrants coming from Europe, being processed at this immigration station, and then being able to disembark and enter the United States. Angel Island served in that purpose on the West Coast, except that immigrants weren't detained for hours, they were detained for weeks, sometimes years. It is not with exaggeration, right, that we say years, because in their detention, many Asian Americans actually had enough time to carve poetry into the walls of the barracks where they were detained. Some of that poetry, there were two barracks, the men's barracks and the women's barracks, and only the men's barracks poetry was actually, written down and translated. The women's barracks sadly was burned in a fire, and so we actually don't have many of those voices of those early Chinese women. But nonetheless, I think when we start to really examine this idea of the Asian Americans and particularly Chinese Americans as this public health threat, we start to recognize, well, this idea that Chinatowns, Americans saw these Chinatowns as, right, a place where disease, pestilence, filth, immorality, vice was alive and well. So much so that this anti-Asian sentiment and that public health crisis even was brought to Mexico, where many Chinese immigrants decided to immigrate when they could no longer come to the United States after they were excluded in 1882. Many ended up going to northern Mexico, to Sinaloa and Sonora, where they made and built thriving Chinese communities and businesses. But yet this anti-Chinese sentiment in the US was also, right, prevalent in Mexico, creating this anti-Chinismo, or this anti-Chinese sentiment. And many Mexicans at this time couldn't agree on very much, but one of the things they could agree on was this anti-Chinese sentiment, again showing pictures of Chinese having syphilis, trachoma, and leprosy, as you can see here. But so one way in which we've addressed this is stricter immigration, right? Stricter legislation. We have to build a wall around the US. Kind of sounds familiar, right? And so I always think, right, what we're seeing and what sounds like absolutely brand new rhetoric today isn't that brand new. We wanted to exclude individuals, particularly for their race, with the possibility that, right, that they would no longer come again, that they're not going to form families. And so we do see, even, right, as from one ethnic group to another, once the Chinese get excluded, Japanese immigrants start coming in larger number to fill that labor vacuum again, because we need laborers. And so when Japanese start to send their young children to school, the Japanese American community was able to form families in large number, unlike the Chinese American community. Quickly in San Francisco, this segregation of the races begins, and we want to divide them in the schools, and the Japanese government was not having any of this, and neither was, of course, the Japanese American community in the United States. But that again didn't stop this growing anti-Asian sentiment. James D. Phelan, the senator from California who was running for re-election, used this campaign strategy of let's, right, stop this Oriental aggression, and these posters of Uncle Sam holding back a sinister Asian hand. But again, right, we're trying to save the idea too was we have to save our state. Look how quickly the Japanese American community is reproducing, and he adds statistics here about the population and birth rate. But again, it's that these immigrant communities were young people who are newlyweds. Newlyweds have kids, and the average size of many families were about 6 to 10 kids. I don't know how they did it. I wouldn't be able to do something like that, and I don't know that many of you would either. But this was quite normal, right? When we think about the average family size in the U.S. But those are the kinds of things that people like Phelan and others were capitalizing on, really pushing forward this idea of, right, America first as a policy. And so one way, right, is use national legislation to try to exclude If that doesn't work, then what we try to do is not allow these immigrants into their neighborhoods. And the Hollywood Association was very famously embraced this idea that we don't want to have any Japanese in those neighborhoods. And so by the 1930s, redlining was alive and well. This is a picture of Los Angeles showing the different colors of the parts of the city. If you overlay these 1930s maps of where redlining occurred, right? Certain people could live in certain places where there was more industrial activity. We see more communities of color. And once we see that, right, we recognize, we look at this, overlay this map today, the wealthier communities are living where there weren't people of color, right? And so these things are not accidental. This is absolutely something that was built into the system. And this is why we say, right, that there's structural racism built into our cities. And so how do we even begin to try to correct this? And this is a big question, right? And so I think one, of course, is learning, educating, studying these things, having dialogues like this one, I think, and this helps because I think it does bring these issues front and center. The past is not safely in the past. We have to kind of uncover that and learn from that, I believe. The other thing to note too, as we moving forward, and particularly surrounding land and rights around that land, in 1942, after Imperial Japan bombed the United States up in the territory of Hawaii. They weren't a state yet, not until 1959. But when Imperial Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, immediately Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our most influential president in the 20th century, signs Executive Order 9066 within months, pushing the removal of 112,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans living on the West Coast into those incarceration camps in the interior. Many of those Japanese were families without any sense of, there was no espionage, no treason, no crimes committed whatsoever by this community, but nonetheless, they were seen as threats to the nation. We initially put them in barracks, not in barracks, in housing, right? Because the incarceration camps weren't even built then. We put them in horse stables in places like Santa Anita and Pomona. And we tagged those families with a number. And this really is showcasing the right? We are dehumanizing American citizens, right? Giving them a number. They are just part of a number, being corralled into trains, into buses, and then onto an incarceration camp. And that's where they stayed for the duration of the war. Many of them never having lived outside of California, for those folks who were from Southern California, going to Wyoming and Idaho, places that, they didn't even have jackets to deal with those sub-zero winters. But I think as we see this, right, and it's important, there are so many memoirs, and I encourage you guys to read these books that are even continued to come out. Even Bradford Pearson just published The Eagles of Heart Mountain. I was listening to that on an audiobook just this morning, because I don't have time to read because I got a little kid. But you got to do what you can, right? We all have to kind of keep learning. But once we start to see, right, so much of Asian America, right, has been about building a better world for themselves and for their families, and coming to the United States and then now having to wrangle and deal with racism seems not like it seems as if they cannot achieve the American dream, right, that has been offered to other immigrants who have come and crossed borders and oceans to come to the United States. One of the things that we know is, of course, Asian Americans have contributed tremendously to the American economy, with small businesses, with their labor, with their bodies, and particularly for Filipino laborers who also came to the United States because they were annexed as a US territory, right? At the end of the Spanish-American War, the Philippines became a territory of the US. Filipinos became American nationals and learned English, learned about American history in the Philippines. Then they came to the US and toiled in early bachelor societies, as pictured here, working in for very, very little, working our farms and fields and canneries, again, trying to build a home in America. And one of the things that we know, particularly for the Filipino American community, is, of course, right, they too experienced much of that anti-Asian sentiment. As I mentioned, the Watsonville riots in 1930. And we often don't tend to think about Asian Americans today, other than perhaps maybe COVID is this isolated incident, right? We don't often think about Asian Americans as a threat. Asian Americans have often been seen as, right, especially in the last 50 years, as perhaps a model minority, as a minority for whom other minorities should look up to. But I think we have to keep in mind too that Asian Americans experience this kind of sentiment of having no having seen, right, exclusion, even in places where they should have been able to continue, but they still nonetheless participated in American life during World War II, and during World War I as well, but also World War II. They were a part of the first Filipino Infantry Regiment, a segregated Filipino American regiment, serving in the United States military. We know a lot about the segregated Black unit and about the segregated Japanese American unit. But also too, there was the segregated Filipino American unit, and another area of Asian American history that we need to continue to uncover. By the 1960s, many Filipino Americans were also a part of the movement for change in terms of their and labor strikes in agriculture, and many of them recognize that it is with ethnic solidarity, inter-ethnic solidarity, that they will be able to make even greater change. And so we see this alliance of Filipinos and Mexicans coming together to organize in labor, to then really build and create a better space for those communities in terms of working conditions and wages. It's in the UFW that we often think about the UFW, the United Farm Workers Union, as a very Mexican-American union that was built by Mexican-American farm workers who were striking in places like Delano in the grape strikes. But in fact, we know that early leadership was both Filipino and Mexican. Larry Itliang, Andy Imutan, Philip de la Cruz, and others were joined with Cesar Chavez, and they met in Filipino dance halls and Filipino community centers, where they were able to break bread, build community, and share information about those strikes together. But all of this, I think, really, I think helps us to see, right, this longer, not just contributions, not just, right, anti-Asian racism, but we also see, right, that Asian Americans have been a part of America, the fabric of American society, from labor all the way up to leadership, right? This has been something that I think just goes undercover because it's made to be invisible. We focus on other things. We make Asian American studies and ethnic studies an elective in our classrooms, right? These are kind of the histories of the folks on the margins that aren't central. But I hope that, you know, as we look more into this, I think that by studying this, we can go deeper and recognize that maybe today we don't have outright, perhaps we are not seeing the kinds of riots and massacres, right? But we are seeing a change in terms of Asian American, the place of Asian Americans in the US today. One thing I think that people, you know, outside of those attacks that a lot of you guys have probably seen on, you know, witnessed on social media and in the news about elderly Asian Americans being attacked for doing nothing but just walking on the street. I think those very visible attacks absolutely must be addressed. But I think beyond that, I think we have to kind of start to look at what else there is that's really rooted at the cause of this. And one thing I think particularly is that there's an issue of microaggressions, and whether folks recognize microaggressions as something that is a big deal or not, the fact that it's sort of like it's like death by 1,000 cuts. Microaggressions are particularly challenging for people of color when you do, right, even if it's a joke, to racialize the virus, right? And I'll let you guys read that yourselves and rather than repeating it. But I think when we start to see that, right, AAPI hate crimes have increased, right? There's something along the lines of 3,800 reports of anti-Asian hate crimes. And this was when I checked this a week ago. And I think, you know, when we think about these microaggressions, even the seemingly benign question, where are you really from, assumes that Asian Americans are foreigners. And many people say, well, I'm just curious about your ethnic background. And so that's wonderful. But I think too, the question is kind of rooted in a little bit more that maybe you're not really from here. Maybe you're not, maybe your ancestors don't, you know, they're foreign and maybe you are too, right? And so it's those assumptions that I think we have to be careful of in our line of questioning. I'm sure people will share where they're from once they get to know you. And so another data set, I think AAPI data also surveyed folks and asked them, right? If, you know, have people ever asked you where you're from, assuming you're not from the United States? And when we look at these communities, there is this sense, right? Asian Americans, showing, you know, almost 64% of Asian Americans are assumed to not be from the United States, right? That question starts to hit hard. Maybe if you are really from another country, sure, that's, you know, a question that folks may want to answer. But if you're second generation or third or fourth generation and nobody in your family speaks the language of your ancestral homeland, at the, you know, everybody's been a citizen for as long as you know that you are from the US, and maybe that's where the questioning might consider ending. As we think about this and try to address what we can do and how to better be better allies, be more educated citizens. I think one of the things to note when we look at the current issues, particularly after the Atlanta shootings of those Asian American business owners who worked in massage parlors, that there is something to understand here, that this is intersectional, right? That racism and sexism often can't be separated here. And particularly Asian Americans, Asian American women have been hypersexualized as objects, not as subjects, not as active agents of history. And we see that continued hypersexualization in US media, in film. And initially, when the news broke about the massacre in Atlanta, those women were stereotyped as sex workers, when in fact many of them were business owners, right? That they weren't, and that what they do there is help you with muscle pain, right? And help their clients with muscle pain. And so I think what we have to be careful of is that Orientalist conflation, that's the root of this issue, not the people who are trying to make a living in the United States. And so people ask often, well, what can we do, right? What's a way that we can actually, I can feel like I'm actually contributing to the solution? And I think we have to keep in mind that Asian American organizing and this activism to make change has been around for a very long time. Asian Americans have had many community-based organizations. Artists, activists, professors, scholars have done a lot of this groundwork. They are making their voice heard. They have been very vocal in a lot of places in a lot of ways. Even if we don't see those spaces, they exist, and they have certainly done much of this work to help to bring the dialogue to regular folks right at the community level. Listen to Asian American calls for solidarity. And I think for many of us we have limitations, and again, these are just seeds, and I'm just giving you guys seeds, and I hope that you can plant them and water them and let them thrive. But educating yourself on a lot of this history is really important. Taking a course, attending these seminars, starting a book club. Our Japanese American Citizens League chapter started a book club, and we've been trying to read Asian American related books. And so, that's kind of one way, and it's easy. You can do it on Zoom, you can do it safely. You don't even need to leave your home, because now that we're all kind of getting better at this, we can certainly take advantage of these virtual platforms to do that. Also, too, PBS has a documentary series, and it's a 5-part documentary series called Asian Americans. And it is so lovely, so well done. They've interviewed people and brought together a lot of voices across Asian America. And if you have a chance, it is available on YouTube. It was only available last summer, and that PBS recognized we need more education on this, and so that is available. I'm trying to have my family watch it too, but it's always hard because I don't want to, how that goes. But also too, I recommend if any of you guys are able to participate in any kind of activism by going and attending organized rallies, right? Maybe take bystander training so you can help if it's safe to do so. And if at all, I think many organizations certainly would absolutely welcome donations to support the work that they are already doing. Another thing I recommend is also considering, and I think too, this is a part of that lifelong education. As you go out and as we slowly make our way back into the public sphere, go visit Asian American history and, or I guess I should say visit Asian American historic places. Go to Angel Island in San Francisco, go to the International Hotel where many early Filipino Manongs lived in this residential housing that was the site of the Asian American movement in the 1960s and 70s. Go, if you're in Salt Lake City, drive all the way up to Golden Spike National Monument to see where we connected the Transcontinental Railroad, because they do talk about the Chinese American contribution. Attend the Manzanar pilgrimage. That's the closest pilgrimage to us here in coastal Central California. And every year they have a pilgrimage to their historic site. And hopefully once they open up again, you can go and visit. If you're driving up to Yosemite, stop by and see these spaces. And even if you're going to be in Stockton anytime soon, I don't know who maybe, but if you gotta go visit, see the Filipino American National Historical Society Museum, because they have a lovely space that they just opened up several years ago. And so since I teach, I often ask my students, I call them responses because quizzes and tests trigger our young folks. And so but I'm going to call it a quiz because you guys are not really my students. So, but I think, you might think about this even, maybe answering these questions. I used to think blank about Asian American communities. Now I know that Asian American communities are blank, and I still wonder about a blank about Asian American communities. So I hope that if we were in a, setting together in the lovely grounds of the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservations, together physically, I'd ask you guys to share this with your partners who are sitting next to you. But since we can't do that, I hope that you'll consider reflecting on some of these things. So, and so thank you very much for attending the discussion today. And please stay in touch. This is my email and social media. And so thank you so much for your attention and for attending today. And thank you again to the folks, the wonderful folks at the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation for all the work you are all doing. So that's all I have today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tamai. It's so important to learn about the systemic kind of patterns of our history and how we can learn from that and celebrate I think positive contributions. So thank you again. So now I'd like to introduce the Trust Director of Programs, Danny Tsai. Danny Tsai has served as Director of Programs at the Trust for Historic Preservation for the past 3 years. Received his master's in TESOL, teaching English to speakers of other languages from American University in Washington, D.C., and has taught at various universities, including UCSB and Johns Hopkins Carey Business School. Danny served in Jordan as a Peace Corps volunteer from 2012 to 2014 and is a first-generation born Taiwanese American. Danny, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Guy. I appreciate it. And thank you, Dr. Tamai, for that wonderful introduction. Let me go ahead and for that wonderful talk, let's go ahead and share my screen for you guys and hope this works. Okay, great. And I also want to thank Kevin and Ann for all the support and the trust in general for giving me an opportunity to work with the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation. I've been here for almost 3 years now, and first started as a volunteer with the Asian American History Committee. Because when I found out Santa Barbara had a Chinatown, Japantown, I just went nuts and was super excited to learn about that. And even though I haven't really faced any discrimination here in SB, I definitely can empathize with those who have experienced that kind of hatred. But, you know, I'm thankful for all you guys attending and learning about, you know, local history and all the systemic racism that has happened in our country. And, you know, education and knowledge will definitely help us get to where we want to be. And so I'm grateful for this opportunity. And I'm going to share some like real quick information about local Santa Barbara history. Like I said, I've only been here 3 years, and I'm constantly learning myself. So there's a lot to cover, but let's go ahead and get started. And for those of you who don't know the Presidio, it first was a Spanish fort established in April 21st in 1782 under King Carlos III. And so about 50 soldiers and their families from northern Mexico traveled all the way up to Santa Barbara and established the Presidio and then also the mission. The Chumash Indians were here obviously before and helped build the Presidio to its structure of what you see in this picture. In 1821, the Mexican War of Independence from Spain was then kind of the catalyst for this fort to kind of degrade, and a lot of the adobe bricks were then used to create other buildings in this area. And further development happened in the early to mid 1800s, and then the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo between the United States and Mexico was the result of you know, the growing tensions that happened there, and then the United States instituted a grid system and further developed that area to what you see in this picture. This is more of a contemporary overhead bird's eye view, and we have the overlay of the Presidio. And what you could see is only a portion of the Presidio exists today. A lot of it is recreated by the Trust, which was founded in 1963. And what we do have is the original, part of an original wall of the Canedo adobe. I'm going to use this little indicator here. So you can see in this Canedo adobe, we do have a portion of that wall that's original, and the El Cuartel, which is this building, and at one point was the smallest state historic park. And that itself is passed down through generations of the Valenzuela family, who was a soldier at the Presidio. And so this is actually the second oldest standing adobe building in California. So very unique to Santa Barbara history, and was part of the reason of why the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation was created as a nonprofit to operate this state historic park. And before I dive a little deeper into the history of the first Chinese and Japanese immigrants to Santa Barbara, I wanted to let you know that a lot of this information came, and the research came from this book here, Santa Barbara Presidio Area, 1840 to the present, and articles published by Richard Piedmont and Stephen Seifert, and also a lot of research done by our own executive director, Ann Peterson, who created the Nihon Machi exhibit, which we have a 360 virtual tour of, since we are currently not open. But let's go ahead and share some history about the first Chinese immigrants. So the first Chinese that came to Santa Barbara were mostly Cantonese from the Pearl Delta region, and they mainly composed of two age groups. A small percentage were those middle-aged men, about 40 years old, who came to California during the gold rush. And this was around the 40s and 50s, 1840s and 1850s. And then the bigger group of Chinese immigrants that came to Santa Barbara were around 19 to 40 years old, and they were here during the peak of the railroad construction. And so that was more of the 1860s and 70s. And in Santa Barbara, they worked in all sorts of occupations, but mainly what attracted some of them were to the Santa Ynez Turnpike over the San Marcos Pass, and then as laborers on ranches throughout the Goleta Valley. It's interesting to know that also in 1883, Chinese fishermen were operating the largest abalone gathering business in Southern California. But this didn't really last, because in 1890, conservation regulations actually restricted the fishing of abalone to deeper waters, and the Chinese didn't really have the capability of diving, so they were kind of run out of business. And what you see in this picture is a temple on East Cannon Perdido Street and a mission also on Chapala Street that were attended by a lot of Chinese Americans. What we have here is Hailong Laundry. And so, like I said, a lot of the buildings, these adobe buildings were recreated or used, the adobe bricks from the Presidio were recreated on different structures. In this specific one, this is on 900 block of Santa Barbara Street and is an original adobe from the former Spanish commander of the Presidio. And it was transformed into the Hailong Laundry. And you can kind of see a little bit of the sun there. So in 1925, there was a big earthquake in Santa Barbara, and that kind of provided an opportunity for a lot of the Santa Barbara city officials to redevelop the area to become more unified and more of the Spanish colonial revival style of architecture. And so within 3 years, most of the buildings of the Chinatown was demolished and replaced. The developer Elmer Whitaker had a lot of connections with this Chinese community and built new buildings on the 100 block of Cannon Perdido. So that's kind of across the street from where the Presidio sits today. And it's 1 block east from where it existed. And the Chinese moved their businesses to the bottom floor and lived in the apartments above. So this was considered the new Chinatown that existed in the later 1920s. There were a lot of long cherished traditions that occurred along this block, such as the Santa Barbara community embracing the Chinese New Year celebrations in Chinatown. And also in this picture to the right, you can kind of see members of the Chung and Yi family setting fireworks in the courtyard of El Cuartel. Other points of note are 1941, we have the new Chinatown becoming more of a focus for raising money for the Chinese relief after Japan had invaded the country. And in this picture on the left, you can see the meeting of Chinese War Relief Committee members. And this was actually in the building of Cheese Shop Santa Barbara. It used to be called Say Cheese, and now it's Cheese Shop, which is located on the 800 block of Santa Barbara Street. In the picture to the right, you see participants participating in this dragon, preparing this dragon for a parade down East Cannon Perdido Street in the Rice Bowl Festival, which was a kind of fundraising opportunity to raise money for the famine that was happening in China as a result of the Japanese invasion. And then we see here in this picture, Jimmy's Oriental Gardens, which is the last Chinese-owned establishment of New Chinatown. And Jimmy Chung operated this establishment. And you can kind of see these pictures of Tommy and Jimmy working behind the bar and greeting customers. We actually have a new exhibit, and I'll talk about this a little later on in the presentation at the back of the bar to commemorate Tommy's contributions to the community. Now we're shifting more towards the Japanese immigrants, and you can kind of see the Japantown would be more of this or this block right here where the Presidio used to exist. And you can kind of see the Presidio overlay above the grid. And you are here, this indicates the Nihon Machi exhibit of the trust. And this was created in 1930s, and you can see all the different lists of buildings owned by the Japanese immigrants and the tenants that were here. The Japanese pretty much came from 2 main prefectures in Japan, Kumamoto and Hiroshima, and they had a lot of connections with other families who arrived in the US before they did. And we have 2 family portraits, one from the Asakura family and one from the Munenyo family. Here. And you can see all these pictures actually in the Nihon Machi exhibit. Like I said before, you can check out the 360 video on our website. Here's a photo of the Asakura Hotel around 1914, and you can see the Japan and U.S. flag being hung as a way for them to kind of show their dual nationality and loyalty to both countries. We have the Buddhist church and the Congregational church. So some Japanese who settled in Santa Barbara were Buddhist and some were Christian, and they built these two different religious institutions on the 100 block of East Cannon Perdido Street. And the Congregation Church was built in 1913. The Buddhist Church Temple was in 1929. And both of these churches are actually still active today, but just at different locations. Here are more photos on, what kinds of things the Japanese Americans did in Nihon Machi. They operated all sorts of businesses, barber shops, grocery stores, billiard halls even. And the Japanese worked as laborers, gardeners, craftsmen elsewhere in the city and outside of it. And in this picture right here, Ike Kakimoto used his car to drive to LA to bring produce back up to supply his shop. And so you can see here in 1926 is when this photo was taken. Due to the immigration restrictions, there was a big, strong generational divide between the Issei, which is the first generation, Nisei, which is second, and Sansei, which is the third generation. The Nisei children growing up in the US had a very different experience than their parents, and the generations sometimes had trouble relating. And this wasn't solely the Japanese experience, also the Chinese kind of had that similar experience as well. But shown in these pictures, you have the Japanese Americans kind of participating in the youth baseball team, and then also just enjoying a day out at a picnic. So this is more of the Nisei generation, the younger generation. In February 1942, we have the Executive Order 9066. And so this was the kind of legislation that authorized the Secretary of War to prescribe certain areas as military zones. And in April 1942, the Japanese were incarcerated at the Gila River concentration camp, the relocation war center. And so Gila River in Arizona. Here we have after the war, a lot of the families, came back to Santa Barbara. Some didn't, and if they were lucky enough to have someone look after their property, they had something left. But most of the times they came back to pretty dire situation. So this photo itself was that same Asakura Hotel photo that you saw earlier, and as you can see, it was completely transformed, and eventually it was actually demolished to create a parking lot in the 60s. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the Filipino community. And so what's really cool is that we have actually the first Filipino settler in Santa Barbara coming in 1782. And he was actually one of the founding pobladores, the settlers of Los Angeles. And he was in LA in 1782 and came to Santa Barbara in 1783. He was a soldier, a gunsmith, and eventually, he was buried underneath the chapel after his death in 1784. So we have a tile in our chapel commemorating Antonio Miranda Rodriguez as the first Filipino settler. The Filipino Association of Santa Barbara placed this plaque in the floor in memory of Rodriguez, and as they have also donated the funds to acquire the altarpiece for the chapel in 1983. So like the Japanese, the Filipino settlers worked throughout the county in the early 20th century as laborers, tenants, farmers growing vegetables and flowers in Lompoc, Santa Maria, and the Goleta Valley. Many Filipinos arrived in Santa Barbara, forming an active and vibrant community throughout the hospitality industry. The Filipino Community Association in this building remains active, and it's at 425 State Street. And then down here, you have a photo of we have the photo of an event at the Filipino Association. And this was donated to the Presidio Research Center by the Fuentes family. Now we have in 1991, the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation has hosted their first festival and opened the exhibit called Nihon Machi Revisited. And so this talks more about the Japanese American experience here in the Presidio neighborhood, less of a focus on the internment itself, but more about the family's histories and oral stories. So this resulted in a new collection of photos donated by community members, and established this new relationship for the organization. In the mid 2000s, this is the kind of SBTHP launched the Oral History Project of the Nihonmachi Revisited at the State Historic Park, and has a bunch of photos that you see in this presentation, and also music that's played during that time period, and a lot of the oral history that we have collected. And if you're curious about it, you should check out the 360 tour. In 2007, Tommy actually sold Jimmy's Oriental Gardens to the trust, and he closed his business. And so he intended that this building would be used to interpret the Asian American history in Santa Barbara. Jimmy's was acquired by the California State Parks and then added to the State Historic Park a few years later. And this is the exhibit that we have newly installed. Kevin McGarry did a lot of work on this. And so we haven't had a grand opening of it yet, but once things are back to normal, we plan on having a big celebration of this. And so this is at the back of Jimmy's, and the Three Pickles owner, Bob Lovejoy, and SBTHP completed this. And it's about the Chung family and their business. It's visible during the Pickles Room regular hours, and we hope to have future guided tours. So after the acquisition of Jimmy's, SBTHP had this new festival and this new established relationship with the Japanese community, and started branching out to create other Asian American history programs. And so this group is actually now called the Asian American Affinity Group, and is co-chaired by Therese Chen and the MC of tonight, Kai Tepper. And we are responsible for so many different programs, including the Asian American Film Series in July, and then the Asian American Neighborhood Festival that takes place in October. And so both have been running for over 10 years now, and we're grateful for all of their contributions. You can see the members here, and an example of the performance we have in the top right, and the film series on the top left. So yeah, it's kind of a really quick rundown of the Presidio neighborhood and the Asian American influence that it's had in history here, and that layers that exist from the Chumash, the Spanish, the Mexican, Japanese, Chinese, and Filipino. So it's super fascinating to learn about, and we definitely hope to educate more people about the history here. And once our site is back open, we can start having more of these programs. And at the moment, we have, we're doing what we can with these virtual webinars. And so I'm actually in the Alacama Theater right now, which is where 2 Wednesdays from now, we're going to be sharing a really cool celebratory kind of event, recorded event that includes dancing and music and spoken word, all from volunteers and people involved with this AAPI community here in Santa Barbara. So please stay tuned for that. And I guess we're going to be going to our Q&A right now.
Danny, thank you so much. I always love seeing all those historical photos of Santa Barbara, and just celebrating the multicultural communities that have existed here, and honoring those histories. So at this point, I'd like to now welcome the Trust's Executive Director, Ann Peterson, to join our conversation. Dr. Peterson is a historian who has worked for the Trust for over 20 years. She oversaw the Trust's Asian American Oral History Project, the creation of the Nihonmachi Revisited exhibit about Santa Barbara's Japantown, and most recently, she supervised the development of the Trust's new exhibit inside the Pickle Room, which is my background. And I actually had to go to the Pickle Room today before hopping on this lecture, just to get the feeling going. Anyways, the exhibit is inside the Pickle Room about the Chung family, owners of the historic Jimmy's Oriental Gardens, which was a central part of Santa Barbara's Chinatown. So, Anne, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks, I'm happy to be here, everybody. I think while we're looking for questions, I could address some of the comments. I think a few of them went to panelists and maybe everyone didn't get to see them. Paul Morey mentioned that redlining happened in Santa Barbara as well up through the 1960s. And so I wanted to let everyone know that we're really interested in this topic and would like to do some more research on this. Dr. Tamai mentioned Los Angeles and the redlining maps. And it's a little easier to find the history of redlining if you were a city that had one of those homeowners loan corporation redline maps. That was the official document that meant it's the smoking gun for redlining in your city. Santa Barbara does not have one of those maps. I think about 30 cities in the country did, but we know that there's evidence available and we would like to do that research. There is a traveling exhibit called Undesign the Red Line that we would love to bring to Santa Barbara. And they support a sort of general set of panels about redlining in the US. And then they help your community do its own research to discover the history locally. So if anyone has source information or evidence, please write to us. You can email me or Danny or Kevin or Kai, and we'd love to work with you. I also wanted to mention that Mary Louise Days put a comment that I think just went to the panelists, highlighting the photo that Danny showed of Nui and Jimmy Chung serving guests in their restaurant at Jimmy's Oriental Gardens. And that was Pearl Chase and Elmer and Barbara Whitaker that are featured in that photo. So it's a really special photo. And Betsy Green also mentioned an 1886 petition that was sent from Santa Barbara residents to support Chinese workers. And I just want to lift up the research of Dr. Xiaojin Zhao at UCSB, who did a lot of work on the local Chinese Americans. And she was able to really demonstrate that the reason that very violent anti-Chinese riots like those that happened in LA and Tacoma and other cities on the West Coast, they didn't happen in Santa Barbara because Santa Barbara, especially large ranch owners, were very dependent on Chinese labor. They found, they experimented with a lot of different types of workers, and they found that Chinese people were very flexible in terms of their agricultural experience back in China, and were able to be help the ranch owners adapt their crops for what was best to grow in Santa Barbara. And so I think Dr. Tamai mentioned this idea of we want the laborer, not the person. Could have been a little bit of that in this petition to try to make sure that the workforce was protected, but the end result is that Santa Barbara did not have the same violent incidents that happened elsewhere. So I wanted to give a shout out to those comments, and thank you for writing in.
It looks like there's a question here. It says, do you have access to the film about Jimmy's restaurant? I'm assuming they maybe are thinking of Grasshopper for Grandpa. I'm not sure. Is there another film that I don't know about Jimmy's restaurant?
I believe that's it. And we definitely know the filmmaker and can get access. So please leave your name and email address. I don't think it's on, Kevin McGarry will correct me. I'm not sure that it's available on Vimeo.
It might still be free to watch on Vimeo. So I'm going to try and put the link in the chat. I'm glad that someone asked about that. It's my brother's film. Yeah, if it's available for public viewing, I'll put it in the chat.
I'm not seeing any other questions.
So I think it is. And hopefully everyone can access this link. It's a Vimeo link. This is Kevin, by the way.
Thank you, Kevin.
You're welcome. Yeah, so that gives a good overview of the history of the Chung family and Jimmy's Oriental Gardens, and a little bit about Santa Barbara's Chinatown.
So we have another great question from Council Member Kristen Sneddon. What can we do locally to address systemic racism? It's a very multifaceted, I think, you know, there's definitely, I think, a lot of action and a lot of, you know, community building that definitely needs to come together. But maybe one of you wants to speak a little bit more about resources specifically to, you know, to this presentation or to the Asian American community, or even how, you know, intersectionality and working with other BIPOC communities in the community can, you know, help fight systemic racism, at least here. You know, it's a big topic, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, I think it all begins with educating yourself and others around you. And Dr. Tamai had a really good list of you know, specific tips that people can get involved with. And yeah, I think it begins there, just sharing the knowledge that you have and being open-minded and trying to go to these webinars and learn about your the local struggles that have happened and the layers of difficulties that they had to face. Yeah.
If I can chime in, you know, just from personal experience, having been born and raised here, and being, you know, biracial Japanese and not being exposed, I think, you know, Dr. Lilian Welty tonight, you know, Lily, you went over yourself in your presentation as well, but not being some of these histories in our schools, right, in our grade school, and those, I think, are searching for that sense of belonging, or have felt othered or marginalized. We look for that. And I think locally, what I would love to see happen is more of an effort to make sure that ethnic studies and multicultural studies are really being centered, you know, from elementary school through, you know, through college, because I think that's it, you know, in my personal opinion, so much of this starts with not just the conversation, but really the education and the exposure.
I encourage everyone to attend next week's session because I think we'll spend a lot of time on that topic. We have an excellent facilitator, Judy Guillermo Newton, who is going to give us all advice and tips on how to be better allies and how to take action. And we're also here from the lived experiences of several of our local Asian American business owners. So today we, I think, set a wonderful groundwork of history. And just by being here and being curious, you have taken a great step. So we're grateful for your participation, and we hope you'll stay with us during the series.
So it looks like there's maybe just one more question, and then maybe we can conclude for the night, since I know we're a little bit over time. So the last question was just in reference to the bystander training. So what is it and where do we get it?
So I can try to take a stab at answering that. I know, so I'm involved with the Japanese American Citizens League in Ventura County. And one of the things that a lot of the kind of the Southern California area JACL members have talked about is perhaps we maybe should think about what we would do if there is some, you know, if we are witnessing a anti-Asian violent, you know, something anti-Asian violence in front of us. What would you do? How would you respond? And many of us don't know how to respond because we may not, you know, be have ever experienced anything like that. And so there are various bystander training programs that allow folks to figure out how to respond in those situations. And so I think I don't have one that I can share immediately, but I know that these are programs that you can even do these virtually, you know, you learn about them and kind of take a class, if you will, on what to do, how to respond, and what's the best way to navigate that. So.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, this has been a really wonderful opening to our three-part series. I'm so excited for this to kind of help facilitate more conversation. Hopefully we've had, you know, some returning friends come to tonight's evening event virtually, and then some new friends. So really thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our panelists. We hope you learned something new. Hopefully you'll be able to join us next Wednesday, May 19th, for the second part of our Santa Barbara Belonging series, where we will hear from 4 local business owners who will share their experiences and perspectives about the contemporary AAPI experience in Santa Barbara. And just a reminder, this is recorded, so there will be the opportunity to share this as well. So if you have friends who weren't able to attend tonight, hopefully we can spread the awareness and continue this conversation going. So thank you again, everyone. Thanks so much for being here, and have a wonderful night.